My name is Arjun Goswami. I'm the chief of the Asian Development Bank's Regional Cooperation and Integration Thematic Group, and a very warm welcome to a joint webinar series that the Economics Research and Regional Cooperation Department and my colleague, who's the RCI director there, Sin-Young Park, and I are jointly hosting. So this webinar, the seventh in the series, is Will the post-COVID-19 recovery in Asia and the Pacific result in greater regionalization of trade and investment? And to take us through that, we've got, I'm very excited to say, a wonderful presentation coming to us from Joe Sveglich, who is our Deputy Chief Economist, and he's had a very distinguished track record in the ADB. On the knowledge side, he's overseen our Asian Development Outlook, which is our flagship publication. He's worked in our strategy and policy department. He served on the operations side in a resident mission. I'm very, very pleased that Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani has found time to be part of the panel. Kishore Mahbubani needs no introduction, but he'll allow me to do it anyway. He's a diplomat, he's a scholar, he's a distinguished fellow of the Asian Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. But what you should all know, and I'm sure you all know, he's a former president of the UN Security Council. He's a founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and many people call him the muse of the Asian century. So thank you. Alexander Chandra, the Assistant Director and Head of Analysis and Monitoring of Trade, Industry and Emerging Issues of ASEAN Secretariat, is here with us. I'm so pleased he's doing so, really on behalf of the kind of 9 ASEAN countries, others knocking on the door, but 9 at present. And he's got a distinguished track record of his own. He holds a PhD in Southeast Asian Studies from the University of Hull, has done a lot of work on ASEAN. So we're looking forward to listening to you, sir. Mohammed Musharraf Hossain we're so pleased you could come and join us. He's a career diplomat of the Bangladesh Foreign Service. He's a fellow Bengali on the other side of the border, but we share a common language, and he's the director of the Bay of Bengal Institute for Multisectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. That's a mouthful, but it stands for BIMSTEC, and BIMSTEC is 7 countries: Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Thailand. I hope I haven't got the countries wrong. If I have, Director Hossain will correct me. He's served in a number of capacities in the Prime Minister's office, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in a number of high commissions. He has degrees both from Dhaka University and the Australian National University in Australia. My friend Debbie Elms is the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore. She brings a marvelous sort of range of experience as vice chair and chair of a series of trade associations and trade policy committees. She's been a senior fellow in Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry, and she's a previous head of the Temasek Foundation Committee. She has a PhD in political science from the University of California. If you haven't heard Debbie before, I think it's a treat to listen to her. So thank you, Debbie. And last, but certainly not least, my good friend and colleague, Safdar Parvez, Director of Regional Cooperation in Central West Asia Department. He is responsible for the so-called CARIC grouping of 11 countries. He has an MA from Cambridge University in economics and a whole string of degrees from Pakistan He's worked in the Aga Khan Foundation. He's done a series of jobs from resident mission to strategy and policy to now regional cooperation work. But really, he's a fantastic, fluent speaker. So with that, let me stop and now give way to the much more exciting, interesting, thought-provoking voice of my colleague and friend, Joe Sveglic, and then we're really going to get into it with the panel. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arjun. You're always a difficult act to follow, and I've got to stop following you at some point. But thank you for those kind words, and I really appreciate the invitation to join today's webinar. My talk will be based on this material that's being prepared for the Asian Economic Integration Report. This report will be released next February, so it's still work in progress. So we're very much looking forward to the feedback from today's discussion, so we can use that to build into improving the analysis. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin today with the key messages. COVID-19 pandemic disrupted cross-border economic activities, including trade, travel, and investment, bringing global and regional prospects down sharply. The pandemic also exposed global supply chain risks and have prolonged economic impacts to the global growth. Despite the impacts that are crossing borders, global cooperation is needed to address the pandemic and to secure a stable, sustainable, and inclusive economic recovery. Strong Asia policy responses and solid regional demand could provide a buffer for Asia at this time. And finally, RCI is also critical in that it is helping to keep supply chains open, helping economies open up, mobilizing resources for a new normal, and fostering greater dialogue on key structural reforms. Next slide, please. So let me begin with the impact of COVID-19 on cross-border flows and economic growth. Next slide, please. As you can see from the chart, emerging Asia's trade value dropped sharply in May of this year by 18% year on year, while the trade volume declined by 6%, also a year-on-year change in the same period. But as deep as this was, it is still much better than the UNCTAD projection that global trade would fall by 27% in the second quarter. Tourist arrivals, which are tourist arrivals to key destinations of the region, stopped in March as economies implemented movement control and cross-border travel restrictions. Next slide, please. The uncertainty had spooked international investors, and this is shown both share prices, but in capital flows generally. Share prices fell in mid-March, reflecting the foreign portfolio outflows, but timely announcement of swift macroeconomic policy responses in March and April, including fiscal stimulus packages, policy rate cuts, and credit and liquidity provisions, have helped restore market confidence in the region. Equity prices bounced back since April, with portfolio inflows resuming in June. But the prospect of robust, sustained recovery is dampened by rising cases of infections in July, as economies, including those in the region, were gradually lifting or easing restrictions and allowing more business to resume. Next slide, please. Consequently, global and regional growth forecasts for this year have been revised down sharply. A deep contraction is now underway in the major advanced economies of the United States, Euro area, and Japan. All three economies shrank in the first quarter of this year, and the contraction will likely be much larger in the second quarter. On aggregate, these major advanced economies are projected to contract by 5.8% in 2020 as a whole, before growth recovers next year, but still expected to only pick up somewhat to 4.1%. Developing Asia will barely grow in 2020. The 0.1 percentage point expansion that is forecast in the June ADO supplement reflected a downward revision from our April forecast of 2.2% projected then. That was already expecting there to be a large COVID-19 impact. Really, it was after the first quarter numbers came out that we got a sense of how big the impact was going to be. With the recent forecast, this is the region's slowest growth rate in 6 decades. Growth prospects for East Asia in 2020 have been downgraded to 2%, from 2% to 1.3%, and this is largely due to a downgrade of the forecast for China, which is now expected to only grow by 1.8% this year. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on globalization. Next slide, please. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated some of the risks to globalizations and global supply chains. The geographic distribution of critical medical supplies, medicines, and medicaments have revealed the need to keep some production of these items within or close to one's economic borders. In addition, the ongoing pandemic highlights the importance of increasing domestic supply inventories of vital goods, including medical and health items. Just-in-time production runs the risk of stoppages if cross-border movement controls are in place. Emergency situation trade barriers can also disrupt global supply of essential goods. So these risks compound the rising distrust in globalization that was already occurring due to uneven gains from trade. Next slide, please. Further, COVID-19 pandemic could leave lasting impacts on growth and globalization trends. According to study by the World Bank, major epidemics have had persistent adverse effects on productivity of the afflicted countries. For example, major epidemics that have occurred since 2000, such as SARS, MERS, Ebola, and Zika, are estimated to have been associated with a 6% lower labor productivity in the affected countries after 5 years. The greater global spread and death toll of COVID-19 than these previous epidemics suggest it could have an even more costly long-term consequences for productivity. This pandemic could also destroy existing capital in a number of sectors, particularly in the aviation, hospitality, recreation, transport, tourism, and real estate sectors. This potential downward shift in capital could further accentuate the decline in labor productivity that is already affecting global production capacity. The current pandemic may also change consumer behavior and preferences, which could reshape certain industries. Tourists, for example, may opt to use alternate modes of transport. Retail trade could migrate to online platforms, and other services as well may increasingly take advantage of online platforms. Next slide, please. Global cooperation remains critical to contain the pandemic and to secure a recovery. Developing Asia benefited from globalization. Export-driven growth strategies and openness to foreign direct investment have provided jobs and lifted millions out of poverty. In East Asia, poverty headcount ratio dropped from 46% to under 1% of the population over 3 decades, while in Southeast Asia, poverty had fallen from 40% to about 4.4% in the same period. As globalization slows due to the ongoing pandemic, reorganizing and sustaining global value chains remains a key driver of economic growth and recovery. Global cooperation is vital in addressing the pandemic through collaboration in the development, production, and dissemination of vaccines and treatments as well. Global cooperation is also needed to aid economies in dealing with the adverse socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, honing in on regionalism within Asia. Next slide, please. Historically, Asia regional integration grows in times of crisis. For instance, intra-regional direct investments expanded strongly after the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. Interregional trade, travel, and debt holdings also improved modestly or remained steadily during this crisis. Next slide, please. As during the global financial crisis, the region's authorities acted swiftly to deal with the effects of the ongoing pandemic. Most opted to use combined fiscal and monetary responses, although there are variations in the type of assistance used, and this reflects domestic conditions. Fiscal packages were used to support small and medium businesses and lower income households to help them to cope with the pandemic. In East and Southeast Asia, direct support to income or revenue amounted to around 4% of GDP. Monetary policies were also used to ensure credit and liquidity provisions and to support economic growth. For some economies, policy rates were cut by more than 100 basis points. Next slide, please. RCI can help Asia recover from the impact of the pandemic. Regional demand can substitute for weak global demand. The region has also ample policy space and ammunition to further support regional demand should the prolonged outbreak weaken external demand further. Some economies in the region could also benefit from potential dispersion of production and shortening of supply chains. And finally, some economies in the region could also benefit from redirected trade and investment. Both the ADB trade war and COVID-19 impact analyses had shown that some economies will benefit from trade redirections arising from reduced exports from China or other economies severely affected by the trade war or the COVID-19 outbreak. Next slide, please. RCI can also complement global efforts in containing and suppressing the pandemic, keeping supply chains open for medical equipment, medicines, and vaccines, helping economies in their economic recovery, mobilizing resources to adjust to the so-called new normal, and finally, by boosting dialogue and cooperation on post-pandemic economic structural changes. This will be particularly important as digital technology platforms become more important. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oops. So let me close here by reiterating the key messages. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted cross-border economic activities, including trade, travel, and investment, bringing global and regional prospects down sharply. The pandemic also exposed risks of the global supply chains and could leave prolonged impacts to global growth. Yet, global cooperation is needed to address the pandemic and to secure a stable, sustainable, and inclusive economic recovery. Strong Asia policy responses and solid regional demand could provide a buffer for Asia in this time. RCI will also be critical for keeping supply chains open, helping economies open up, mobilizing resources for the new normal, and fostering greater dialogue on key structural reforms. So I hope this sets the stage for a very interesting discussion, and I'd like to thank again the organizers for inviting us today. My colleagues are here attending, and they are be happy to respond to any of the questions that might arise related to the presentation. So with that, back to you, Arjun.
Thank you very much, Joe, much appreciated. So thank you for a thought-provoking presentation, which has laid out some of the issues for us. And maybe to start off with, let me start with Kishore Mahbubani, if I may. Now, what Joe has laid out is that there is trade tension going on between the US and the People's Republic of China. Are we seeing a decoupling? Is this the end of globalization? Is this a choice between globalization and regionalization? We're no longer kissing cousins? Or do you believe that Mark Twain was right when he said, "My death has been much exaggerated"? Kishore, over to you. Or you have to unmute your mic.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you well.
Great, thank you. I was just saying it's such a pleasure to be back in the ADB family. I remember fondly my many visits to Manila, and I'm sorry I cannot be there in person, but I hope to come back in person to ADB. I want to thank you for the generous introduction. I also want to thank Joseph for his excellent presentation, because in some ways he's laid the foundations for what I'm going to say. And a key word that Joseph used, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the very first line of his very first slide, is about disruption. So I think all of us can feel in our bones that we are undergoing some major kind of disruption. But it's important for us to understand that actually we're not just experiencing one disruption, the obvious one, which is COVID-19. We are actually being hit by three disruptions. And I think it's important to understand all three disruptions, because unless you sort of understand the source of the problem, you then cannot find the solution. And so the first, I'm going to quickly run through the three disruptions. The first disruption was caused by what I call the end of history moment in 1990. So how was that a disruption? Well, it was a disruption because 30 years ago, when the Cold War ended, the West came to believe that it had literally, to quote Francis Fukuyama, reached the end of history. Everybody else in the world had to make strategic adjustments to deal with this new world order, but the West didn't have to do anything. The West could just go switch on autopilot, carry on with their liberal democracies, and all will be well. And unfortunately, as I document in my previous book, Has the West Lost It? Sadly, Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West, because it put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when China, India, and the rest of Asia were waking up. And clearly, when Asia, over 4 billion people, decide to wake up, that is obviously going to create a great disruption, obviously. And in the midst of this great disruption, the West went to sleep. And the price that the West is paying for this is now evident, because as a result of refusal to recognize that when suddenly, for example, China injects 800 million new workers into the global capitalist system that will lead to what Trumpeter called creative destruction, lots of jobs were obviously lost in Europe, in United States, and sadly, no one did anything about it. No one. And as a result of that, that's created, in the United States, the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. It's created a sea of despair among the white working classes. It's led to the rise of populism in the US and Europe. And I have to mention all this because we live in a world, when you ask what is the future of globalization, what makes it difficult to answer the question on the future of globalization is that the custodians of globalization traditionally have been the leading Western countries, the leading Western industrialized countries. But unfortunately, the populations of these leading Western countries no longer believe that they're benefiting from globalization. So their inclination is to shut their doors. And that's what's happening in the West. But in Asia, Asians have become the biggest beneficiaries, as I'll document later, from globalization, but the Asians are not aware that it is now their responsibility to become the custodians of globalization. So the first step is to understand that Asians can no longer be passive bystanders on issues of globalization. Now, the second great disruption that has surfaced, and one that you mentioned earlier, is that we are about to witness the biggest geopolitical contest, and possibly the biggest geopolitical contest since human history began, between two of the largest powers, most powerful countries we have seen since human history began, which is the United States of America and China. And I want to emphasize, as I document again, as my document in my latest book, As China Won, this is being driven by deep structural forces. Okay, I just mentioned three very quickly, so you understand this is a very big game. The first, of course, is the fact that whenever the world's number one emerging power is about to overtake number one power, the number one power pushes down the emerging power. That's happened for 2,000 years. Graham Allison has documented this. Now, second point I want to emphasize, I want to touch on it in one sentence, but I want you to understand why there's an emotional dimension to the US-China dispute, which is there's always been in the West a fear of the yellow peril. I'm going to inject this yellow peril dimension because you're dealing with like heavy emotions here and not just with reason when it comes to understanding the US-China dispute. And the third structural force that's driving is the deep disappointment in the West, which explains why there's a bipartisan consensus in the US against China, because the United States believe that if it engaged China, China would transform itself, become a liberal democracy, become like United States, and that hasn't happened. So that's the third reason why you have this major driving forces that are driving this major US-China geopolitical contest. And that's the second disruption. And the third disruption, I won't say very much because Joseph has spoken about it very much about the pandemic. But it's important to understand that that's not the only thing at play here. Because frankly, if only the pandemic was at play, the obvious solution, by the way, the obvious solution, again, and another old rule of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if the enemy of the United States is COVID-19, the enemy of China is COVID-19, logically, US and China should press the pause button and say, stop, stop, stop. Let's stop fighting each other. Let's come together and fight COVID-19. That would be a logical, rational response. Why isn't it happening? It's not happening because of the second disruption that I mentioned, that the major US-China geopolitical contest has broken up. So clearly, we are dealing with a very difficult situation. So the question is, what do we do about this? That's the big question. And here, I want to emphasize, when it comes to solutions, I want to emphasize that since we are talking in Asia, we have to first acknowledge that the last 30 years of Asian history have been probably the best 30 years in 300 years, maybe the best 30 years in 3,000 years. If they've been the best 30 years, why have they been the best 30 years? Why have our livelihoods improved so much? And here I'm going to mention, I mean, of course, it's a complex story, and you can many books about this, but I'm going to emphasize one key dimension, which is the openness to trade. And there's a fantastic correlation between openness to trade and then human well-being and prosperity. And here it'd be interesting to compare, and I found some statistics. And if you look, for example, at the GDP growth of key countries, and I picked two East Asian countries, China and Vietnam. And I picked China and Vietnam because China and Vietnam have only been fighting each other for 2,000 years. That's all, not very long. And Vietnam has been occupied by China 1,000 years. So if you think the India-Pakistan issue is difficult, I think the China-Vietnam one is slightly more difficult. So I picked 5 countries, right? China and Vietnam from East Asia, India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. So let me start by just giving the increase in trade over the last 30 years among these countries. Within India and Pakistan, trade has gone up 14 times, 1-4, not bad. Within India and Bangladesh, it's gone up in the last 30 years, 24 times. Now, within China and Vietnam, who have fought each other for 2,000 years, in the last 30 years, their trade has gone up 827 times. 827 times. And what is the result? The result you see in the GNP figures. So how much has Pakistan's GNP gone up in the last 30 years? From 40 billion to 278 billion, 7 times. How much has the GNP of Bangladesh gone up? From 31.6 billion to 302 billion, 10 times. India, 9 times. Now, how much has the GNP of Vietnam and China gone up in the last 30 years? Vietnam's has gone up 40 times. China's has gone up 40 times. So there is a very clear correlation between openness to trade and well-being and prosperity. So this is my last point. If there's one critical lesson that all Asians should take away from the last 30 years, it is that at a time when the Western countries are turning away from international trade, trying to close their doors to globalization, we mustn't do the same. We must do the opposite, and we must continue to keep our doors open to international trade. Because if there's one thing really that can keep East Asia going, it is if we don't change course over what we have accomplished over the last 30 years. And fortunately for us, we are still signing free trade agreements. We have completed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Let's implement it. We completed the CPTPP. Let's implement it. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have actually made the right decisions in terms of keeping our borders open. The important thing is for them to keep these borders open, and then we will not be infected by what is happening in the West. Thank you very much.
Kishore, thank you very much. Very exciting sort of response from you. Everything from Francis Fukuyama through to theories of hegemon competition to where the future will lie for the region based on your analysis of the past. So Debbie, I guess my question to you is, if you looked at the trade and investment trends and what has been occurring even pre-COVID, I'm picking up on something which came out in Joe's presentation and which Kishore touched on. Is it really true that we are committing to openness of trade and investment? COVID may have been a black swan event, but is the region really committed to that? Is that the trend which we can simply continue on? Or were the trends prior to this already pretty bad and they've just got much worse? So is it gloom and doom? Is the glass half full, Debbie, or is it half empty? Over to you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's always a challenge to follow Kishore because he always has this incredible, a sense of how the world has come together over 2,000 years. And then what are you going to do to follow that up? I would say for the glass full, half empty, it's a bit both. And I think it has been a mixed picture. We have both the strong pressures in Asia for integration, have had that for some period of time, but have also had impulses that are pushing towards greater protectionism. And I would argue that COVID has unleashed both ends of that spectrum. So there are some governments in the region who are seizing on COVID and restructuring supply chains as a result of lots of changes in globalization to argue for greater integration, more openness, maybe slightly differently formatted than before we had COVID, just because right now it's difficult to argue for exactly the same set of policies that you would have argued for last year. So maybe some slight variations, but basically more integration, more innovative kinds of approaches to resolving integration. That is true for many governments and many countries in this region. But balanced against that are protectionist impulses, which are always there in most markets. I think it's probably there in all markets, to be honest. But a pandemic and a huge, sharp, sudden contraction in economic growth, a loss of jobs, concern about health, fears for your economy, all of those kinds of tensions, of course, drive the political impulse to be more inward focused, to say, let's try to, batten the hatches, to hunker down, protect our people, and avoid opening up to others. Now, that is a real challenge for political leaders in particular, because you can see why that feels like such an imperative for you to follow. And so what we have in the region, I would argue at the moment, is a bit of both. We have some governments pursuing greater integration, For example, we have a lot of different kinds of arrangements right now in the digital space, digital only commitments, Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, Australia, Singapore, Korea now getting underway. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, meeting to discuss potential expansion next month. We have the regional integration happening in RCEP, 15 economies across the region, working to conclude the last little legal details in particular this next month as well, so they can sign this agreement in November and have sort of Asian trade for Asia. So we have all of that happy integration stuff, balanced against some problematic policies in different markets. And in particular, where we see this had early in COVID was around restricted access for medical supplies and equipment, and potential food bans or export controls, or concerns about what happens to our food supply, which we heard quite some time ago, but then it sort of died down a bit. And now it seems to be resurging, and now, thankfully, dying down a little bit, so we have a little less of the focus on food. But an early reaction to COVID was to say, let's restrict movement of food so we make sure, again, that we feed our people, that we make sure that we save whatever medical equipment and supplies that we have for our people. Some of that has gone away, which is excellent news as well. But we see it again, I would argue, that sort of protectionist impulse, particularly now in the digital space. So we're watching it very carefully, follow the imposition of new taxes, rules on data flow, rules on e-commerce, rules on labeling for products that are on e-commerce marketplaces. There's all sorts of ways in which that protectionist impulse is showing up in certain markets in certain ways. And so again, that sort of uneven tension, I think, is a challenge. It's a challenge for all, I would argue, for all regions. But here in Asia, for some reason, maybe it's just, Asia's enthusiasm, we see it strongly on both ends, which is good, because it means that we have both those forward-leaning, let's make sure that we stay open marketplaces, and we have those who are even on the end that says, let's protect our own. It has not yet gotten to the point where you really have to be alarmed about the closing of markets, because we could imagine, or I could certainly imagine, governments responding by really clamping down on the movement of goods and services in and out of an economy. And we have not seen that yet here. Now, we might see that somewhere else, but not here in Asia. So I think even across our spectrum is a little more still skewed towards openness, because these are very trade dependent economies on the whole, some more than others. And when you have trade disruption, trade dependent economies tend to want to stay more open than less trade dependent economies do. So I think that interesting tension is taking place, some of which predates COVID, but COVID, of course, accelerates any sort of flaws and faults that you might have in the system, I think, because it's just such a shock. And the shock on COVID, and let me just sort of say this and then finish. For me, the challenge of COVID is that it's a challenge in multiple ways. Of course, it's a health problem, but it's also a supply problem and a demand problem, and it's global. So if you are a firm, especially trying to navigate this, all of the rules that have underpinned your existence are suddenly sort of thrown out the window, and you have no clear way for you to forecast what you think comes next. So when you are dealing with health issues, plus supply problems, plus demand challenges, plus government regulations that come in on top of that change your environment, then you are often paralyzed as a company. Which way should I go? And I think that has, again, created some really interesting opportunities for some firms who can seize those opportunities, and some real challenges for businesses who cannot navigate that entirely new existence that they may have to navigate, at least now, and then into whatever the new normal looks like, however fast it arrives on our doorstep. So let me stop there and then respond more.
So very exciting first round, because what you guys are telling us in a way is there's reason for hope because of the inherent maybe desire for the region to remain open, but it's a cloudy picture. There were pre-existing and still current trends. We shouldn't be misled just by the tariff wars. There's other stuff happening underneath on the non-tariff side. And if we take Kishore's point, Asia is not one united whole. That's not the case. It's operating in different ways in different parts of the region. So let me switch now to something which people regard as a $64 million question, Kishore. In this new post-COVID world, knowing with all the uncertainties that are out there, knowing that you have been a crystal ball gazer par excellence, who are the new winning players going to be, in your view? Post any decoupling that may take place between the US and China, if we follow through your line of thought, it's not a temporary issue. This is a longer term issue. So what happens to other players in the region? Who's going to gain? Are those gains going to result in some permanent winners? Who are you betting on, Kishore? Over to you.
Wow. I think it's important to emphasize that a very critical point here, that the battle against COVID-19 is not over, right? We're still in the thick of battle. And unfortunately, in some countries, COVID-19 is actually gaining momentum, United States, India, Brazil, and so on and so forth. And I always say that when you're in the middle of a battle, you're surrounded by the fog of war, right? And I think it's very dangerous, very premature to say that this country is going to be a winner, this country is going to be a loser. And for example, let's say, and this is of course Donald Trump's dream, that if the United States comes out with some miracle vaccine that is available in large numbers, the American people say hallelujah, they vote back Donald Trump, and then it's a different world, and the whole world, by the way, the whole world says, thank God we have United States saved the world again. So that's a potential likely outcome. But if you ask me to make a bet as of this stage, my guess is that China is going to emerge the big winner because they have shown a level of competence in the management of this crisis, which is quite remarkable. And what's interesting is that the impulse, if this had happened 50 years ago, it would have been the United States would have been very strong, very confident, very certain. And the United States would say, we're going to keep opening up to the world. We're going to keep engaging the world. That's what the United States stands for. And at that stage, as you know, 50 years ago, China was a complete closed shell under Mao and Zhou, completely closed, right? And China certainly didn't believe opening up to the world would save China. But what's different now is that in the United States, now there's a huge political impulse to close up. Huge, it's very powerful. And even though I can tell you that many senior policymakers, actually in the US, are now getting very troubled by this. And actually are now finally beginning to put the brakes and say, stop, we're going too far. We still got to live and work with China and so on and so forth. But in the case of China, paradoxically, China has gone to the other extreme. And if you have time to read one speech, read the speech that Xi Jinping gave in Davos in January 2017. I was there when I heard that speech. Here's one critical paragraph. He said that the reason why China has thrived and done so well is that China finally decided to, these are the words he used, to jump into the choppy waters of globalization. And when we jumped into the choppy waters of globalization, we swallowed water, we struggled to swim, we had difficulties, but we came out of it. And so what is Xi Jinping's view and what is the consensus view and Li Keqiang and all that? We have to keep opening up because that's how we have thrived. That's why we have stayed open. So the likelihood, therefore, is that the regional integration will continue in this region and countries will keep growing. So, for example, I can tell you that the reason why I chose China and Vietnam is that Vietnam's obsession basically is how to handle a rising China. And paradoxically, the answer to that, the way to handle rising China is to trade more with China. And that's what they're doing. And then they're both succeeding and they're both doing very well until they work out new modus vivendi. Just imagine a world where India and Pakistan decided, hey, we really got to take care of COVID-19. And you know something? I've seen the figures. Pakistan's GNP goes up like 7% immediately, and India's 2-3%. It just no special trade, normal trade, just normal trade between India and Pakistan. It's the biggest boost you can give to the Indian-Pakistan economy. So if I was an economist advising the Pakistan government, I say, why are you going to the IMF for assistance? Don't bother. The IMF will really squeeze you and rinse everything out of you before they give you anything. Yeah, you just have normal trade relations and you get a 7% boost to GDP growth. That's amazing, right? So that's why I kept emphasizing my message about being open to international trade, and since I think all the East Asian countries, by the way, not just China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and ASEAN, most of them believe that that's the way we have to keep on going. And so as a result of that, I suspect that if the protectionist impulses grow in the United States and to some extent also grow in Europe, then clearly the shift of power, and I've written about this, as you know, in recent columns, the shift of power to Asia will only accelerate. But my only hope is that South Asia will learn a bit more from Southeast Asia and a bit more from East Asia.
Kishore, thank you. So in a way, the message is you can win if you're open. And it really doesn't matter what the relationship is. If you can open, then you're going to come out well. But Debbie, my question to you is as follows. Everyone keeps saying, if we're looking at these trade trends, and if we look at Joe's presentation as well, that the major uptick in this doom and gloom situation is still digitally enabled trade, right? So who are going to be the big players in digital trade, Debbie? Who should we be betting on there? Because there's sort of all sorts of discussion about 5G players. There's all sorts of discussion about some companies acting really in a loss-leading capacity in national economies and really strangling off smaller players. And then there's talk about small, nimble, disruptive players taking advantage of technological disruption. I mean, as someone who's steeped really in trade, like really in this area, what do you think? What's your view? Winners and losers. Over to you.
I'm going to say, well, I think it is difficult to come up with winners and losers at a time of so much disruption. So I don't want to go there. But I will say that in general, two things are crucial for the winners in the digital space in the future. So the first are those countries that have sensible digital rules and policy frameworks in place will do better than those who are a problem on the digital side. So those governments that encourage, that foster digital developments of all kinds, that have clear, transparent, consistent regulatory frameworks in place to govern the digital space. And the digital space is huge, right? It's everything from e-commerce packages to digital services, to data movements, to e-payments and electronic signatures. And I mean, there's a whole lot of things in the digital economy. But those governments that are more open, transparent, clear, and consistent in the digital regulation space will do better than those who are not. And I would say those firms, those governments that think hard, because we're talking about your audience is largely government, those governments who craft digital rules to get their smaller firms, their MSME sector, online and participating in the much larger economies, both in their own economy, but also their neighboring economies and potentially globally, they win. So you need to create a sensible, fostering, supportive environment for the digital trade of the future. And then you need to encourage your small businesses to participate in that future with you. So the only way that small businesses can flourish and benefit from digital trade is if you make, and this is why it's a sort of happy, virtuous cycle, if you make clear, transparent, sensible rules from the beginning, then it's easier for your small businesses to grow. And so I think that those two parts of the policy environment are critical going forward, because without bringing along the small businesses, you lose a huge part of your economy in every market. And you lose the potential innovation that comes from that, and absolutely critical today, the jobs that come with small businesses. So you need to get your small businesses to be digital, but they will only become digitally savvy and do well if the policy environment matches their needs, which means you need to, again, make sure that it's clear and transparent and so forth. And when you do both of those things, you win. When you are protectionist, especially in the digital space, it is more problematic than in the old offline space, because the world is really global in the digital environment. And so if you start chopping off my market, if you say you can't have access to the following kinds of platforms and services because of X or Y, then costs go up, it becomes more difficult. Your small firms end up being like corralled domestically instead of being allowed to be like the micro multinational, so me and my garage can create a world-beating whatever it is not possible if I create rules that are only domestic. So I think that's what you need to do in order to be successful going forward.
Debbie, thank you very much. Sort of message, a Schumpeter type message. Small is beautiful, and take advantage of that in terms of a competitive technological disruption era that's coming. So maybe let's turn now to Alexander Chandra. And Alexander, I think what I'd like to ask you is, in light of everything that you're hearing and the presentation that was made, right? It's a sea of these disruptive forces that are occurring technologically, protectionist wins, tariff wars, issues of COVID. ASEAN, which way do you think it's going to go? What do you think ASEAN policymakers are going to do? Because it's maybe straightforward for economists to say, keep markets open, keep trade flowing, keep capital flowing. But is that what you are seeing from ASEAN policymakers? Or are you seeing efforts to reduce dependence on trade because it's a way in which people are looking at their security in an uncertain world? And ASEAN is often at the very center of this type of debate. So, Alexander, over to you.
Thank you, Arjun. And thank you also for extending invitation to myself and also to the ASEAN Secretariat. A very good pleasure for me to contribute to this discussion. And thank you also for the previous speakers and panelists who have shared their point of view. I think I learned a lot from this discussion so far. But to answer your question and very, briefly, I think as a region, and it has always been a tradition for us to actually keep, to maintain our, to strengthen our commitment to open regionalism. And of course, this mean that we are going to keep our market open, as you already pointed out. And to explain this, let me just show you some of the data, because the ASEAN Secretariat has, since the beginning of the pandemic, following the development of the, how our member states and our dialogue partners are actually responding to the pandemic in relation to their trade and investment policy measures. Of course, data is also available from the WTO and as well as the International Trade Center, and they have shown a lot of a number of trade restrictive measures being introduced since the pandemic. But for ASEAN and its dialogue partners, we have 10 dialogue partners and also 10 ASEAN member states. So in total, so far we have seen about 100 trade measures as of early July 2020. And surprisingly, actually, the majority of these are actually liberalizing, 62 of them, and 38 restrictive. And what is also interesting is that out of the 100 being issued between ASEAN member states and ASEAN, ASEAN has only issued about 38 of them, and whereas our partners 62. And of course, despite this fact, a major concern for us is the broad-based resort to export restriction on essential products such as vital medicines, medical supplies, and food. And we know for a fact that these products have already been subjected to fairly high tariff even before the pandemic. So with the crisis happening, so this even exacerbate our concern about the imposition of this tariff. The same also goes with investment. In fact, on investment policies, if you look at like Untitled Investment Monitoring Hub, there's actually relatively smaller number of investment measures issued compared to those of the trade, and even less with regard to our ASEAN member states. And the good news is that, of course, as we move towards, I mean, it has been like about over 6 months, half a year since we had the first pandemic. I think from the beginning we have seen a lot of number of countries imposing restrictive trade measures, but increasingly there have been a lot of number of countries that have been abandoning their restrictive measures as well. So this is a good news. Having said that, I think many are still remain, and there is still a risk for this measure to become permanent. So this is a real concern for us in ASEAN. To come back to your question, where is ASEAN heading in this regard? Again, I think if we can learn anything from history, I think one thing that I'm very sure, I'm a student of ASEAN integration, is that ASEAN always do well during the crisis, and we do hope this continues to be the case with the current crisis. And to prove this fact is that I think ASEAN has realized very early on during the pandemic, the importance of regional and international cooperation. And as you said, keeping our market open and ensuring our supply chain connectivity, particularly for essential products, to be remain intact. And to illustrate this is that I think there have been a lot of number of statements being issued by our leaders and ASEAN economic ministers. In fact, as early as 11 March 2020, our ASEAN economic ministers, this is just shortly before when the WHO actually issued an announcement that the COVID-19 becomes a global pandemic. We had already issued a statement on strengthening ASEAN economic resilience in response to the outbreak of COVID-19. Which reaffirms, among others, our commitments to maintain economic and integration policies. And then, roughly about a month later, you may recall that you may be familiar that there was a declaration on the special ASEAN Summit on COVID-19, and this again gave a chance for our ASEAN leaders to express the commitment to keep our market open for trade and investment. And also, I think one thing that our leaders underlines is the importance for us to enhance our cooperations, not only among our member states, but also with our external partners as well. And more recently, about a month ago, there was a special AEM meeting on COVID-19, where the Hanoi Action Plan, the Hanoi Plan of Action on strengthening ASEAN economic cooperation and supply chain connectivity in response to the COVID-19 was adopted. This helps operationalizes the mandate that was already mentioned, identified by the ASEAN leaders' commitment I mentioned earlier on, and reaffirms our commitment, our resolve to keep the trade flows open for essential products, and also for us to be able to establish a mechanism to do so, while also working towards a longer-term supply chains resilience, including by leveraging on digital technology. Now, I know, I mean, like maybe with ASEAN, you have often heard about the declaration and so on, and documents and so on and so forth. But beyond this declaration and statements, I think one thing that needs to be kept in mind is that ASEAN remains committed to keep our market open by continuing to implement our trade agenda. And this is a lot already, as you may be familiar with ASEAN Economic Blueprint 2025. So among other things, we continue to refocus our efforts on trade facilitation, including the reduction of transaction costs and addressing NTMs. We are also very keen in tapping the potential of digital trade, as well as I mentioned before, to engage with our external partners. I mean, in addition to a number of joint statements that we have done with our dialogue partners, such as China and Japan, there have also been a commitment to sign. You may recall on the 23rd of June of 2020, there was a minister statement by the Minister of RCEP, where there was a statement, there was for RCEP agreement to be concluded by the end of this year. And so that we can signal to the global community our support for the multilateral trading system, regional integration, and economic development in the region. And of course, in addition to that, we are also talking with our existing FTA partners in terms of the potential of upgrading our FTAs, so that this is to ensure continued effectiveness and relevance, yeah, to make sure that our FTAs are matching the global realities. So moving forward, to conclude, I think there is also a development post-recovery initiative that we are thinking of. In fact, just tomorrow, there's going to be high-level dialogue on the subject. I think the ADB is also invited to contribute to that. So in this, I hope once this is developed, we hope that this initiative will take into account the role of trade and investment in the post-pandemic recovery. So that's it. Thank you.
Alexander, thank you very much. So interesting sort of set of data, which shows that ASEAN is still trying to stay the course on openness and open regionalism. So let me maybe turn to Mohammed Musharraf Hossain, because you represent a regional grouping that spans South Asia and Southeast Asia, right? So where do you think the BIMSTEC countries are headed in terms of openness? Is it, I'm open so long as I can get access to somebody else's market, but I'm not open in my own market? Or is it a different position? And how do you see this evolving in the future in light of all these pressures that are coming? It's not an easy, I mean, it's easy for us maybe in a forum discussion to say keep channels open, but there are a lot of pressures on policymakers. So where do you, what is your reading of BIMSTEC policymakers? Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Goswami. Thank you so much. Since I'm speaking for the first time, so let me just thank you once again for introducing me with your nice words at the beginning earlier. Okay, as you have rightly pointed out that I am representing an organization just which consists of 7 countries, 5 from the South Asia and 2 from the Southeast Asia. So I will try to put forward the BIMSTEC perspective while answering all of your queries. And before I proceed to that one, just let me also thank you all the speakers like Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani and also Ms. Deborah, with their insightful thoughts, which has enlightened me as well. So now I'm going to give you the BIMSTEC perspective regarding all of your queries. I hope you will get some answers from here. So as you know, the primary objective of BIMSTEC is to strengthen economic and physical connectivity in the region through more trade, investment, travel, and exchanges by leveraging geographical advantage and available resources. Therefore, the topic of today's discussion, whether the post-COVID-19 recovery in Asia and the Pacific would result in greater regionalization of trade and investment, is very relevant to us as well. As the global supply chain has been severely disrupted by COVID-19 pandemic, it has created opportunity for more intra-regional trade in the region. However, the question is whether the countries in the Asia-Pacific region are prepared to seize this opportunity. As far as the BIMSTEC region is concerned, it is considered to be one of the least integrated regions of the world, both in terms of physical and economic connectivity. Inter-regional trade volume within the BIMSTEC region is only 6.3% at this moment, which is well below the trade volume within ASEAN region. To seize this opportunity, BIMSTEC countries would need to agree on some trade facilitation measures, including simplification of customs procedures, introduction of electronic tracking system from cross-border container movement, acceptance of electronic copies of export-import related documents, and expand e-commerce. Secondly, regional trade facilitation measures need to be accompanied by efficient transport connectivity to ensure easy movement of goods and people in the region. Renewed emphasis will be needed to develop a resilient regional transport connectivity system capable of withstanding future disruptions. To enhance inter-regional trade, BIMSTEC is negotiating the Trade in Goods Agreement of the BIMSTEC FTA and Customs Cooperation Agreement. BIMSTEC is also in the process of finalizing the BIMSTEC Transport Connectivity Master Plan study with the technical assistance from the Asian Development Bank. ADB has also been carrying out analytical studies on 3 key priority areas of cooperation in the BIMSTEC region, namely financing for transport connectivity, trade facilitation, and tourism promotion. The implementation of the outcome of the study will definitely promote greater regionalization in the BIMSTEC region with enhanced and integrated economic activities and investment opportunities. It would, however, be necessary to bear in mind that regionalization of trade and investment has its limits. For instance, Bangladesh's major export destinations are located outside the region, and as such, it would be more practical for Bangladesh to diversify trading partners rather than abrupt regionalization of trade and investment. The same may be true for many other countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Our approach should be to utilize the full potential of economic cooperation within the region, and that should get our priority attention in the post-COVID-19 era. The economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic is unlikely to go away within a short period of time. This will be a time for Asia and the Pacific countries, and particularly the BIMSTEC region, to create economic activities through more inter-regional trade, transport, infrastructure building, financial cooperation, promotion of SMEs, etc., with increased investment. Assistance from the international partner, that's why ADB, IMF, World Bank, and other relevant partners will play a crucial role in this process. So before I conclude, let me reiterate on behalf of the BIMSTEC Secretariat that we greatly value our collaboration with the Asian Development Banks and look forward to expanding it in the post-COVID recovery and rehabilitation as well, actually. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, interesting because you're still stressing trade facilitation in this environment. And taking the Bangladesh example, you're really sort of stressing open regionalism as well. So that's an interesting perspective. Now, I think the question I really want to ask as a follow-on to you, we're going to switch gear a little bit from policy to collective action and repositioning. And I want to start with a provocative question to you, Mohammed Musharraf. You have many trading partners within BIMSTEC and outside. There are tensions. We keep talking about the tensions between People's Republic of China and US, but there are tensions within the region, India and People's Republic of China, right? So in light of this, how are you planning to take forward collective action? Bearing in mind that many of the BIMSTEC countries also have a big trade relationship with China, how is this to work? And I ask you this because we're seeing some interesting things coming from SAARC. We're seeing SAARC coming with a pandemic response. We're seeing SAARC coming with bilateral swap arrangements, currency swap arrangements. How is BIMSTEC planning to take forward its collective action? How will it position itself? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, just before I go to that one, just let me remind you just 2 things. Like there's a BIMSTEC, we have like 2 broad mandates actually. The first mandate is to strengthen economic, physical, and people-to-people connectivity within the region. So China is not a part of the BIMSTEC, first thing. The second, the mandate is to promote common actions to address vulnerabilities, including poverty, terrorism, transnational crimes, energy security, food security, climate change, natural disaster, and public health. And I believe that these two mandates will remain equally relevant in the post-COVID recovery and rehabilitation in the region, actually. So let me also enlighten you with some of the data as well. Like, as I have mentioned you earlier, that BIMSTEC is the least integrated region compared to the other regional organization. Like, as I mentioned you earlier, only 6.3% total inter-regional trade, as well as the FDI inflow is only 1 to 3% during the 2015 to 2018. So there are a lot of actually huge scope for greater regionalization of trade and investment in the BIMSTEC region. Actually, so to facilitate that one, the BIMSTEC countries are currently actually negotiating a number of agreements and protocols that would form an integral part of the BIMSTEC FTA. Some of which are particularly like the agreement on dispute settlement procedures mechanism, and as well as agreement on cooperation and mutual assistance in customs matter are actually ready for signature. And you will be happy to know that like our leaders will be meeting, like the senior, very important meeting, like the senior officials meeting will be held in 31st of August, actually virtually due to the COVID situation. And our leaders summit was also supposed to be held in September. So we are also working on that one, whether we can hold that one in virtually. So we are hoping that we will get a clear direction from that leaders summit as well as the other important officials meeting. So that will give BIMSTEC some other directions how to navigate through these global changes and other things. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So Alexander, just one more to you on the collective action issue. And the question really, Alexander, for you is the following. You know, Kishore referenced at the beginning as evidence of East Asia and Southeast Asia's continued commitment to cooperation and open borders, RCEP. Is RCEP going forward? What's your expectation, Alexander? I know these are very difficult things to predict, but you know, maybe you've got special insight that RCEP is going to suddenly be signed in the midst of the COVID crisis. So, Alexander, give us some good news. Over to you.
Of course, we are still in the middle of the, I think Deborah indicated, earlier on that we are in the last stage of our negotiation, and there's only so much that I can, I'm at liberty to say, of course. But as I already mentioned, I mean, the commitment is still there. Again, on the 23rd of June 2020, there was a minister statement. Let me just emphasize this again for RCEP member countries to agree on the conclusion of the negotiation by the end of this year. Again, this is to signal our, to the global community, our support for the multilateral trading system, regional integration, and economic development in the region. So especially amidst this, global pandemic, I think a lot of the it gives a better rationale for us to actually, accelerate our economic integration with the RCEP countries. So that's the short answer. So
thanks very much, Alexander. Very diplomatic and very good. I appreciate that answer. I had to ask, Alexander, so that's great. So let me now turn to my good friend and colleague, Safdar. And I hope he can turn the camera on so that people can see how handsome he is. And I'm going to get into trouble with all the other panelists for having called him handsome now, but never mind. So Safdar, my question to you is, in terms of policy, given the crisis that globalization seems to be in, and notwithstanding the efforts on regional cooperation to try and infuse energy into it, the difficulties of WTO and regional agreements, Is it time for multilateral development banks to move from trade facilitation to trade policy? Or is this not an area of comparative advantage for us, notwithstanding how deep the crisis is? What is your view? Safdar, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Arjun?
I can hear you fine, and I can see you clearly on the screen, Safdar. So over to you.
Okay. Okay, many thanks. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very august panel. I'm indeed honored to be a part of it. Arjun, my take is that this is absolutely the wrong time to jettison trade facilitation. I'll come to trade policy. And that is because trade facilitation has been hurt really badly by COVID-19. In order to rebuild trade competitiveness of developing countries in Asia, we need both trade facilitation as well as trade policy. And what we have seen here is, and particularly in the region that I work in, Central and West Asia, it has been marked by closure of borders, delays in shipments, causing food and medicine supply shortages. And in a way, we need a rejuvenated trade facilitation agenda that tries to capture how to keep trade channels and trade flows open during times of pandemics or during times of other emergencies. I think somebody just mentioned, the importance of continuing to reduce the costs of cross-border trade through connectivity projects, border control improvements, trade facilitation, harmonization procedures. People talk about single window operations. So it's not as if that agenda is now complete and that we should leave that aside and then move on to trade policy. I think it really we need to emphasize both. But I think when it comes to trade policy, also I think we also need to really see and have some clear objectives in mind. I mean, of course, in our region, for example, we are still helping countries accede to the WTO. It's an important part of the trade policy work we are doing. We are trying, already to, sort of streamline tariff and tax regimes and industrial policy actions that help countries move away from policies of import substitution. There is a lot of work on non-tariff barriers to trade to improve international safety and safeguard standards. So I think a lot of that work is also currently ongoing. But I think we have to be also careful that in terms of promoting trade policy, and trying to link it with this whole agenda of regionalization. As we know, regionalization would work when the trade expansion impacts are greater than the trade diversion impacts of regional trading arrangements, and we have to be considerate of the multiplicity of regional trade agreements and free trade agreements that are coming up. And so I think the kind of trade policy that we need, has to take into account some of these aspects as well. I think the other thing is that, leaving aside, the debate between globalization and regionalization, what we see in a lot of our member countries is that a lot of the trade liberalization measures that they took in terms of streamlining and reducing the tariff bands and so on was because of domestic reform exigencies, and they took them really in a way on their own. Many of these reforms have been supported by multilateral institutions. Kishore was talking about India, Pakistan. Right now, we are implementing a program in Pakistan on trade and competitiveness improvement, which is trying to trying to grapple with some of these trade policy issues. But I think where multilateral efforts have really not borne so much fruit right now is to cast these types of reforms that are already going on in the individual country level in more of a regional envelope for them to become mutually reinforcing. I just want to say one more thing. because post-COVID, I think there's a lot of discussion, and I'm grateful Deborah raised the issue of digital trade, and to that I would like to add the whole issue of trade in services, because I think a lot of these things are becoming much more important. Again, they have both trade facilitation as well as trade policy issues. You want to promote digital trade, yes, you need harmonization of policies. But you also need some to create some rules on the ground for and parity along countries in order to sort of trade digitally in a more competitive environment. In the area of trade in services, very relevant to the COVID right now, I mean, we are now working on issues, for example, on how to promote trade in health services and regional approaches, to trade in health services, for example, to facilitate mobility of patients and doctors across borders to seek medical treatment. How do we improve information sharing on regional health services, for example? How do we move towards pool procurement services for small countries in the region so that they are in a better position to negotiate collectively with pharmaceuticals and to bring the prices of drugs and medicines down? I think those are very important issues now that are coming up, and again involve both aspects of policy as well as facilitation. I think the other area, and this is my last point I want to make on this issue, is trade in tourism services. Tourism has been hit badly by COVID, but how do you reimagine tourism and regional tourism in the post-COVID environment when so many jobs and businesses may have actually closed down for good? But then again, I think to promote tourism trade, for example, how do you bring in regional health and safety standards that help travelers go across borders? How do you create more harmonized tourism standards and skill sets of tourism operators so that travelers can expect a regional level of service? So I think in a nutshell, the agenda in my view is moving on, and we have to, in this new age, look at trade facilitation in a new light, not give it up. Look at trade policy issues that are coming up, and particularly how do we relate to these issues back to digital trade as well as trade in services. I think to us is the question of the day. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Great reminder on the issues of trade diversion. If you start making choices between regional and global, and great reminder that the trade facilitation agenda remains unfinished, but to really move it forward in the post-COVID era, we need to look at hard-hit areas and areas of big opportunity in services and digital trade to take that further forward. I guess my remaining question to you, Safdar, is this, because I've been asking the others about collective action. And you represent one of the collective action platforms, CARIC, but this is probably, one of the biggest crisis points that we've faced in terms of cross-border cooperation. It's not the normal. So what should the platforms that ADB is actively supporting itself, yours, GMS, the South Asian platforms and others, what should they do together? How can they act together in concert? What would your proposal be? What great new forward step on collective action should we take? And you're a man who likes boldness, vision. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Arjun. I think, in my view, these sub-regional platforms that ADB has promoted over the years, starting from the early 1990s, GMS, CARIC, SASEC, and others, I think they really have helped build internal institutional ownership and helped create homes for regional cooperation. They have provided excellent informal mechanisms that have allowed for frank, open, and constructive discussions, which is sometimes more difficult to do under formal treaty-based organizations. I think at the same time, these platforms have demonstrated considerable convening power by getting ministers and senior officials of these countries together several times a year to discuss and debate issues of regional importance. I think it has also helped that institutions like ADB have been able to provide subsidized secretariat support over the years. And I think more importantly, we have to remind ourselves that these platforms have really not just been talk shops, but they have really inspired action on the ground and resulted in connectivity and infrastructure project, which in the case of the CAREC program, which I represent, runs into billions of dollars. But having said that, I think there are some disadvantages also, of promoting informal or more, less formal cooperation platforms. Because if you want to negotiate regional trading arrangements or free trade agreements, for example, it's difficult to do so in an informal setting. Sometimes country ownership is difficult to achieve, and also, it becomes more difficult to negotiate and discuss things with more formal organizations. But having, I think, said these things, first and foremost, I think these platforms themselves need to be made more agile, sustainable, and responsive. Given the post-COVID environment, and really we are doing a lot of reimagining and rethinking about how best to position some of these platforms in this new environment, where regional cooperation cannot just be taken for granted when countries actually close borders and created difficulties for other countries in the region, and how do you mend some of these things going forward. But I think the bigger issue that you mentioned, I think bigger platforms are also needed. Because of the need for a wider or a global kind of facilitation of knowledge, given some of the bigger agendas. As you know, one of the things that we have been trying to do in the ADB context, in the context of these platforms, is to promote more inter-regional cooperation rather than just intra-regional cooperation. And So basically, for example, in the context of the countries that I work on, we have been trying to promote energy trade between energy-rich Central Asia and energy-starved South Asia. And you have got several sort of different examples, there as well. And then you also have, countries which have overlapping memberships in various different types of regional cooperation platforms. So I think so the one direction really is to move towards that direction by identifying substantive agendas on which inter-regional cooperation, not because of an ideology, but because of the practicality and the need for promoting cooperation on the ground, that these platforms can come into being. But in order to do that, and Arjun, as you mentioned, that I have some provocative views sometimes. I think in a paradoxical way, when you want to promote bigger things and bigger platforms, you need more players, and that's why inter-regional cooperation comes in. But I think in some ways, frankly, ADB may need to take a step back in order to create space for other multilateral institutions to play a more prominent role in these regional cooperation platforms, sponsored early on by ADB. But I think now, as the agenda is becoming more complex, it is not possible for one institution to do justice to all of these platforms. And by taking a step back, and for example, in the CAREC program, we are saying we are welcoming other multilateral institutions to take front line and leading roles in various clusters, of the CAREC program. So I think that is really important. I think the other thing I want to mention, is financing. Bigger things require more financing, and I think one of the problems, I think, in the whole regional cooperation architecture everywhere has been the relative failure of providing regional financing mechanisms to match with regional cooperation platforms. In the case of ADB, for example, even today, the bulk of the financing for regional programs comes through country assistance pipelines and country portfolios, which, as you know, are difficult to do given the problem of externalities. Countries tend to prioritize national projects, and I think what the need of the day really is that we need to promote more regional financing platforms, such as the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund is there. But in CAREC, for example, we are trying to experiment with the idea of establishing a regional infrastructure financing facility over and above, country programs, etc., to provide some aspect of a regional kind of financing issue. I think the last issue I wanted to say is, because the nature of the agenda is changing, So, for example, as Arjun, under your leadership, we are focusing much more on global and regional public goods, such as climate change, environmental protection, global health security, and others. And this really, again, requires bigger platforms, and it requires us to connect these regional cooperation platforms that we have with more sort of global institutions that are looking after some of these agendas, which even if implementation is done regionally, the agendas are truly global. And how do we really connect our regional platforms to those global institutions, I think is another way of creating bigger and more robust platforms to deal with these new contemporary issues that we now see emerging. Thank you very much.
So excellent, Safdar. Yes, continue the same, but don't stay the same. You may like the old boy band One Direction, but don't remain one directional. So all good. I think we're in the dying minutes, but let me ask one question to a person from the floor, because I know he's there. I hope he's there. Jaime Augusto Zabel de Ayala. He comes from a storied business house in the Philippines. And my question to you, sir, is we've been discussing about globalization and regionalization today, but you have a business house that is engaged not just in the Philippines, but in other countries in the region. What kind of repositioning do you think businesses have to go through now in the post-COVID era? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Arjun. First and foremost, a big hello to Kishore. I haven't seen Kishore in a little while. What a pleasure to have you here, Kishore. Thank you. Actually, there's one issue that's very much on my mind, Arjun, which I think was not really addressed. I believe the trade-related issues are going to take care of themselves one way or another. I think we can't go back to an unglobalized world, and I think consumers will demand products, and innovation will take us in those directions, and people and the efficiencies of the capitalist system will always look for products and services to go down. But I put forward an issue perhaps for Kishore and Deborah. Trade-related issues, I believe, will sort themselves out. I'm more worried about the technology bifurcation that's beginning to take place in the world. Together, I think Kishore's opening statements were very valid. I think the world is a better place for the kind of cooperation and coordination we've had on the economic front globally. And I think many countries have risen because of it. And as Kishore pointed out, so many of us, the Philippines included, have really profited so much from joining, I guess, this globalized environment. But one great benefit of this globalized environment, and Deborah referred to it in a national setting, but I'm putting it in a global setting, is the standardization that has taken place both in genetics and medicine that have led to all of us beginning to work under a common framework. And that has allowed critical mass in the making of equipment, standards in terms of medicine. And we're seeing this bifurcation in particular on the technology front, telecommunications being only one element of it. And that worries me. And I'd love to hear from Kishore and Deborah any thoughts on that front. And also in medicine, I think the different ethical standards, particularly around genetic medicine, which is going to be transformative in the world, vary around the world. There have been attempts to create a framework, a global framework around these issues. But I do believe, and I know this is a sensitive issue, and I don't mean to be provocative, the standards around some of this work is different in certain countries versus others. These are the ones that actually worry me more. I think trade will sort itself out, but any thoughts on the technology bifurcation and what it may lead to in the world would be very much appreciated. Thank you again, Kishore, Deborah, and the rest of the speakers. Thank you, Arjun.
So even though I should open up to the floor, I know, and for those of you who are on the floor, please blame me. I'm a terrible moderator. I have left no space, but we really must, in reply to Jaime's clear question, Kishore and Deborah, I'm going to close with you because who could close better than the two of you? So we'll start with Deborah and then go to Kishore because Deborah, I agree with you. It's very difficult to follow from Kishore, though I must admit it's difficult to follow you as well. So Deborah, you first.
Thank you very much. I think this is two very good questions that are related in some ways, but also separate. Technology bifurcation is going to be the reality, at least for the near term, as we have different policies, procedures, standards, et cetera, that seem to be pursued in different marketplaces. We have some of that happening now, and you can see the challenge that firms are having, in particular, consumers are having in navigating different platforms, different settings, depending on which market you're in. You already may have to carry, well, not that we're traveling at the moment, but when you were traveling, you may have to carry multiple phones, you may have to have multiple devices, you may have to have multiple platforms in order to communicate back and forth again. Each time that happens, it increases the complexity. It makes it harder for business to do business. It makes it harder for consumers to move as freely as they are used to consume goods and services from around the world. It makes it especially hard for small businesses because they cannot access places that have different standards in place for everything from data privacy and protection to platforms that are allowed and not allowed to all kinds of things. So I think that does create real challenges and will continue to create challenges. At some point, we may have to come back together again and sort out this mess that is currently being created. One more that I would add to that is digital taxation policies, which are also incompatible and inconsistent. And so at some point, it's going to get too complicated, and hopefully we will come back together and sort this out. My preference, of course, is that we don't make a mess in the first place, that we try to keep consistent and so forth, but it's just hard. So we may have to come back and sort it out at the end. The same thing is true on medicines, which is to say, and in medicines is true with everything, the more that countries create national level standards and national level guidance, the harder it is to move goods like medicines, like PPE, like any other kind of product around. And so I think you want to always, if possible, peg to international standards because it allows you to serve the world and to get those products, many of which are critical, no matter where they're created, into your market because your standards are not incompatible with everyone else's. So large global agreements, international standards, the less fragmentation we have, the easier it is to operate, especially, again, small businesses and for consumers to benefit.
Debbie, thanks very much. Kishore, views from you?
Well, let me begin by agreeing with Deborah that we may be moving into a world where we're carrying 2 or 3 cell phones or 2 or 3 laptops. That's a horror scenario that may well happen. But to respond to you, Jaime, it's such a pleasure to see you again. The technology war is partly about technology, but also, as you know, about geopolitics. I mean, in theory, they are objecting to Huawei 5G because they believe Huawei 5G will suck all their information and feed it to the Chinese government. Huawei is not independent, therefore you've got to keep it out. But actually, what's driving this is there's a kind of, I guess, the deep state in the United States has woken up to the reality that within 10 to 15 years, China's economy may become bigger. Now, so there are people who believe, and actually I know this quite well, inside Washington, D.C., that this is the United States' last opportunity to stop China. And they actually believe that the reason why China has succeeded, whether it's true or not, false, we'll separate that, but they do believe that the reason why China has succeeded is because China has access to the American market, so they're going to close that door to the American market. And number 2, the reason why China has succeeded is because China has got full access to American technology, so they're going to close the door to Chinese technology. And they believe they close the American market and they stop access to American technology, China will fall backwards and China's growth will stop. And I think that may happen, but I think it's hugely mistaken. I think it's what they're trying to do is there's an old expression: the horse has bolted, but they want to close the stable door. Too late, the horse is gone. So China's technology has taken off. China cannot be stopped. So in the next 10 years, that's what I more or less say in my book as China Won. It'll be very messy because they're still trying to sort it out. But at some point, they'll come to the realization that China cannot be stopped. Really, it cannot be stopped. And so after that, then hopefully reason will come back and everybody will come back and say, let's try and rationalize and create common standards. And I completely agree with Deborah when she said that even in medicines, we should create common standards, and we should create common standards everywhere. And at the end of the day, I do believe that the American people and the Chinese people will be better off if we can press the pause button on this geopolitical contest. And my goal actually is to persuade both of them to take a wiser course, stop this, and we will all be better off. And that's also why I think people like you, it's very important for you also to speak out and to say, hey, right now we should all come together, focus on fighting COVID-19, deal with the immediate challenges, and put everything else aside.
Kishore, thank you very, very much for that. In order to avoid being lynched in the ADB corridors when we can physically meet again, luckily I'm working from home, so the audience who are listening to this can't get to me. But mindful of my future, I should allow one question, one from the floor, in case someone has it. Do I hear a question, either hand raised or in the chat box? Mr. Perdiguero, if you're there, do you have a question? Oh.
No, not really. I think it's really very, very impressive speakers today. So I was just saying that I think is a critical moment. I think really to keep markets open and really to work together with the countries and continue working. I think as Safdar mentioned, we are well positioned in ADB to really keep doing a lot of things with our sub-regional programs. That is good. But that's not enough. And I think tomorrow our Vice President will talk to ASEAN. ASEAN is preparing a new plan on how to deal with COVID-19. I was helping, BP to put this together, and really our message is loud and clear, which is ADB is here to help you. Markets should be kept open, trade and investment and tourism. And these are difficult times, and these times in which I think it's more important than ever to work together within the regions, but also to fight together for more globalism. And Asia is there, I think, despite of all the challenges. But congratulations and thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. With that, please allow me to thank a fantastic panel, wonderful presenter, really rich, great discussion in the midst of a COVID crisis, a reasoned, logical, rational, thought out position, keep markets open, and we will do it together. Thanks again. Goodbye and take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.